Lecture 60, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
We began this part with the French dramatist Molière, whose work embodied neoclassical values and also prefigured the rational and progressive claims of the Enlightenment. We end with a German writer, philosopher, and scientist who was born at the height of the Enlightenment and whose work has come to symbolize the literary and cultural values of Romanticism. From his early novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which was published in 1774 and which drove men all over Europe to commit suicide in imitation of Werther's despair, to his magisterial drama Faust, which preoccupied him his entire adult life, Goethe's work is both intensely classical and yet quintessentially romantic. His belief in a more organically structured and felt experience, as opposed to the formal aesthetic restraints of neoclassicism, pervades his work, whether in lyric poetry, the novel, autobiography, or in his extensive writings on botany, geology, anatomy, optics, and psychology. We shall concentrate in this lecture on Goethe's Faust as a way to understand the philosophical and aesthetic concerns that define late 18th and early 19th century Europe. Goethe was born into the Frankfurt elite in 1749. His mother was the daughter of the mayor. His father was a wealthy private citizen who devoted his energies to writing memoirs of his Italian journey in Italian, patronizing the local artists, and above all, educating his children, the future poet and his sister. At an early age, Goethe studied several languages as well as art and music. By his early teens, he was casting his school exercises in the form of an epistolary novel written in German, French, Italian, English, Latin, with occasional postscripts in Greek, and Yiddish. In his free time, one assumes he had some, he wrote plays in French and poems for all occasions. Goethe attributed great importance for his early development to the social and political situation in Frankfurt, where trade, the annual fairs, the ceremonials associated with the crowning of the Holy Roman Emperor, and the occupation by the French during the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 63 brought cosmopolitan experiences to his city. He studied law first in Leipzig, then in Strasbourg, where, in 1770, he met Gottfried Herder, leader of the Sturm und Drang, a movement that stressed subjectivity and the unease of man in contemporary society, as well as the theme of the revolutionary man of genius in rebellion against conventional society. The aesthetic aims of Sturm und Drang were romantic in that they intended, 1, to make an iconoclastic break with received forms and values, 2, to use folk or primitive materials ranging from ballads to puppet shows. And this was something that was also taken up, by the way, by the English Romantics, Wordsworth and Coleridge, who in their first publication, Lyrical Ballads in 1792, employed many ballad forms in which they were influenced by Herder. And the third was to engage literary ancestors outside the native tradition. In the case of German writers, this meant looking to classical Greece and to Renaissance Italy and England, especially Shakespeare. Out of an unhappy love affair came Goethe's first success, The Sorrows of Young Werther, composed in 4 weeks and published in 1774. Werther is an epistolary novel, that is, a novel structured through letters and therefore a traditionally 18th century kind of novel. It became an overnight bestseller, portraying a young man smitten by a woman and relying, as Rousseau's Confessions does, on the expression of an intense emotional state to construct character. Though boisterously celebrative of both nature and children, Werther ends up committing suicide, and the novel launched a string of copycat teenage suicides across Europe, so that in some places the book was banned, thus greatly enhancing its celebrity and no doubt its sales. In 1775, Goethe moved to the small town of Weimar at the invitation of Charles Augustus, Duke of Saxe-Weimar, and would live there more or less for the rest of his life, with one brief tour to Italy from 1786 to 88. It is important to remember that Germany was not at this time a nation-state, but a group of some 300 principalities, among which the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar was one of the most important. By the time Goethe arrived in Weimar at the age of 26, he had already begun work on the Faust drama. He would continue to expand the text for the rest of his life, another 60 years or so. Because Faust represents basically the whole span of Goethe's creative adult life, it can stand for the accomplishment of that life, just as Goethe's monumental literary reputation is tied to German political and cultural history. Goethe was also one of the last great polymaths of European culture. Like Leonardo da Vinci or John Milton or Adam Smith, Goethe served as the chief minister to the Duke of Saxe-Weimar for 10 years. He designed the Weimar Theatre and served as artistic director of it for many years. He did important work in optics and the theory of color. He made an important anatomical discovery about the human body, and he published significant research in the new scientific field of botany. Even Napoleon asked for an audience with him and discussed Werther in particular. Goethe has been described as the last classical writer of Europe, just as Virgil was the last classical writer of Rome. Goethe's collected works, plays, novels, memoirs, and travel writing, including letters and diaries, run to 143 volumes, plus 5 additional volumes of conversations with various interlocutors. Most critics have come to Goethe's own conclusion about Faust as expressed in a letter of June 1831, about a year before his death. "It is no trifle," he said, "to put forth in one's 82nd year what one conceived in one's 20th. And to clothe such an internal, living skeleton with ligaments, flesh, and skin, and on top of that, to wrap a few mantle folds around the finished product so that it may altogether remain an evident riddle, delight men on, and give them something to work at." His remarks remind one of James Joyce's remarks about Ulysses, that it would keep the scholars busy for centuries. Goethe's metaphor is entirely Faustian. Goethe's lifetime artistic project is like a Frankensteinian creature, but a beautiful and productive one. And the description of his great work as like the creature built by Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel of that name is entirely apt, given that Frankenstein, like Goethe, is entranced by the idea of perfectibility, the belief that the species can be improved. An idea that both Goethe and Shelley owe, of course, to Rousseau, who shares his birthplace, Geneva, with Victor Frankenstein. Goethe's Faust is crafted to give men pleasure unto future ages precisely because it also provides an ongoing source of wonder, a riddle, something to labor over. It is a work that embodies the fascination of what's difficult. Faust, a work in 2 parts, the second nearly twice as long and much more abstract in its action than the first, is written in the form of a play, but it was virtually unstageable in terms of stagecraft in Goethe's day, and parts of it may remain so even now. Goethe himself called Faust a tragedy, especially the second part, composed almost 40 years after he began work on the first part. It has often been noted that Faust is not condemned, but is saved, and indeed is elevated to the celestial sphere in a way worthy of Dante's Pilgrim. This is not the traditional ending of tragedy. The Faust legend was originally published in 1587 as a chapbook, an inexpensive publication sold in the streets, and shortly thereafter it was adapted to the Elizabethan stage by Christopher Marlowe. But it had been kept alive in Goethe's youth not by the legitimate stage, but by the puppet theatre, folk stage. Goethe makes several significant changes in the old legend of the scholar who makes a pact with the devil Mephistopheles. Goethe's Faust seeks not power through knowledge, but access to transcendent knowledge denied to the human mind. The pact is transformed into a bet under the terms of which Faust will be allowed to live as long as Mephistopheles fails to satisfy his striving for transcendence. Most significantly, Goethe makes the second half of Part 1 into a love tragedy. Faust seduces Marguerite, an innocent young girl who embodies for him the transcendent ideal that he seeks. She is condemned to death for killing their infant, but at the last moment, as Faust and Mephistopheles abandon her in prison, a voice from above declares that she is saved. Critics have likened Goethe's play more to Christian epics such as Dante's Divine Comedy or Milton's Paradise Lost than to drama, because of its extensive panoply of characters and worlds that inhabit it. From God himself and his angels to Mephistopheles, the devil, to humans of all social ranks, to supernatural and phantasmagorical creatures. Whatever else Faust may be, it is a German work, a celebration, which is another reason why it is not a tragedy, some have argued, of German nationalism. The roots of the story are not, as some commentators assert, legendary. They extend only as far as early modern German history. The historical Faust was a contemporary of Martin Luther, who died in the late 15th century, and was said to be, this is the historical Faust, not Martin Luther, was said to be a neighbor or a business partner or maybe swindler of Johannes Gutenberg, the man who introduced the use of movable and therefore reusable type, a technological revolution that allowed Luther, for instance, to imagine that the Bible could be disseminated in the language of the people instead of in Latin, a language available only to the learned. Goethe's desire to represent the range of human knowledge in German is captured in Faust's debates with himself about how to translate into German the opening of the Gospel of St. John, deciding that Luther's word, Wort, for the Greek logos, is too mild. After rejecting mind, Sinn, and force, Kraft, he settles on Tat, or act, which is consistent with Goethe's own definition of man as Tätigkeit, activity. The play Faust is an attempt to show that the German language is capable of as broad a range of lyric, narrative, dramatic, acoustical, and semantic effects as any other vernacular poetry. The play is almost an encyclopedia of poetic forms, an effect that is difficult to reproduce or appreciate in the English translation. Dialogue is constantly interrupted by song, as Goethe inserts arias, lyrical songs that imitate action, as in Gretchen's spinning wheel song in Faust Part 1, 13th century Latin hymns translated into German, medieval Scandinavian folk songs, Bavarian drinking songs, and a pseudo-medieval 19th century courtship song that Mephistopheles sings, in which he advises young women not to sleep with their lovers until they have a ring on their finger. One can imagine a country and western version of that. What Goethe is doing for the German language is similar to what Horace did, that great exemplar of classical values, what Horace did for Latin in his first book of Odes, to show that Latin could express, as well as Greek, every lyric form of which the language was capable. Faust's last vision is of a progressive future of scientific and technological marvels such as the reclamation of land from the North Sea, the construction of canals in the Suez and Panama, and especially between the Danube and the Rhine rivers, a vision of Germanic solidarity and an ominous foreshadowing of German expansionism in the 20th century. This is Faust speaking. I see how to give those millions a new living space. They'll not be safe, but active, free at least. I see green fields so fertile, man and beast at once shall settle that new pleasant earth, bastioned by great embankments that will rise about them, by bold labour brought to birth. Here there shall be an inland paradise. Outside the sea, high as it can reach, may rage and gnaw, and yet a common will, should it intrude, will act to close the breach. Yes, to this vision I am wedded still, and this as wisdom's final word I teach. Only that man earns freedom, merits life, who must reconquer both in constant daily strife. In such a place, by danger still surrounded, youth, manhood, age, their brave new world have founded. I long to see that multitude and stand with a free people on free land. The Faust of tradition is a quester after knowledge, and for the Renaissance mind, the Faust legend was a cautionary tale of pride or arrogance. Marlowe's Elizabethan dramatic version of the legend functioned as a sophisticated morality play in which the audience learns to avoid the vices of the play's protagonist. Goethe's Faust, however, longs for experience, or more precisely, he needs to vanquish experience by constant vigilance. As he puts it, only that man earns freedom, merits life, who must reconquer both in constant daily strife. To be even more precise, Faust's idea of Tätigkeit, or human activity, is that it is comprised of a desire that can only be satisfied by more desire. The end of desire is not to end desire, but to make desire desirous of more. Faust himself articulated this sense of desire when he speaks of Gretchen. The longing that I feel for that enchanting image of a woman is busily blown up into a leaping flame, and so desire whips me, stumbling on, to seize enjoyment, and once enjoyed, I languish for desire. Some have called such desire the essence of romanticism, and indeed there is in romanticism a constant sense of desiring tied inextricably to a strain of nostalgia, a yearning for something lost. Perhaps because the traditional sources of certainty and authority were no longer available, and by definition no truth acknowledged by the romantic artist could be permanent. Thus the quest itself, the desiring for, now becomes the subject of art. Faust's idea of desire is also certainly related to Blake's notion that activity is good, the root of evil being a rationality that preempts or trumps desire. Other critics have called such immodest or excessive desire the necessary condition of capitalism. Insofar as Faust is about desire, that is, about want, its production, its pursuit, and its consumption, it is implicitly then about economics. Two economic transactions condition all the other action in the play: a wager and a contract. At the beginning of the play, Mephistopheles extracts a wager from God that he can induce the soul of Faust to defect from its true source. The Lord, in turn, agrees not to interfere. Mephistopheles takes all this to mean, mistakenly it turns out, that he will have access to Faust's immortal soul in the end. Mephistopheles and Faust also make a contract. Mephistopheles will serve Faust's desires until the moment when Faust wishes an earthly bliss to become permanent and not to perish, at which time Faust will forfeit his life. Mephistopheles also takes this contract to mean that Faust, if he breaks the contract, will forfeit his soul to the devil. In the end, Faust does voice a vision of imperishable freedom and dies. Mephistopheles declares that all is fulfilled, ironically imitating the consummatum est of the Bible, which marks Christ's death. But the angels reply only that all's over now. Indeed, Mephistopheles becomes distracted by the young male angels who seem to be making seductive advances to him, and during his distraction, Faust's immortal part is snatched away by them and they soar upwards, leaving Mephistopheles in what we now see is his perpetual condition, confusion. For many readers, the final solution to the problem of Faust's fate has seemed a kind of shaggy dog story. God was in control all along. Mephistopheles never had a chance. The wager was rigged. The contract was bogus. But the play is not about either of these plot devices. It is about the process of making desire processive, ongoing, not terminal. This is a particular problem for Faust when his desire turns, as it inevitably must, to libidinal desire. For his pursuit of the young woman Marguerite, nicknamed Gretchen, ends, if not in tragedy, then at least in full pathos. Faust seduces Gretchen, impregnates her, and in addition to killing her brother in a duel, allows her to be condemned for infanticide. At the end of the play, he tries to get the nearly insane Gretchen to break out of prison and follow him. She, however, feels that the legal judgment against her is just. Faust is dragged away by Mephistopheles as a disembodied voice cries out from above, "She is saved," a premonition that neither Mephistopheles nor death itself will have the last word. In an earlier scene in a garden when Faust is trying to woo Gretchen, she asks him whether he believes in God, an important question for the audience as well if Goethe means salvation to be a serious theme of the play. This is how he responds. "Who, my dear, says Faust, can say I believe in God? Ask any priest, any philosopher, and what you get by way of answer sounds like a joke, pure mockery." Marguerite says, "So you don't believe in him?" "Don't misunderstand me, sweet girl, please. Who can give a name to him?" he says. "In good conscience say what he believes. And where's the man who truly feels, who has the hardihood to say, I don't believe in him?" The all-embracing, all-sustaining power of heaven and earth, doesn't he embrace and sustain you, me, himself? The sky arches over us. The earth stands firm beneath our feet. And don't the stars with friendly eyes eternally mount aloft? And don't I look at you? Don't our eyes meet and mingle? And all there is, all things, don't they strain yearningly toward you, acting and working invisibly, yet visible all around you, an everlasting mystery? Fill heart with it until heart overflows in an ecstasy of blissful feeling, which then call what you please, happiness or love or heart of God. I know no name for it. Feeling is everything. The name just noise, just vapor, dimming the heavenly fire. Feeling is everything, says Faust, declaring himself a true child of the anti-rationalist, sentimental discourse of the early 19th century, prefigured in the Confessions of Rousseau. The uneducated Gretchen answers that what Faust says is all right. The priest speaks so or pretty near, except his language isn't yours, not quite. Gretchen's innate but untutored insight is, of course, right on target. Faust is speaking the language of the romantic priesthood, affirming as sacred the idea of desire that can endure as mystery without any temporizing reaching out to an actual object. This faith in the sacred power of desire itself is also why Faust survives Gretchen, why in fact the play must go on beyond the tragedy of Gretchen. Why the play must go on is precisely the part of the romantic priesthood that applies to Goethe's own predicament as author. Having committed himself to a philosophy of Widerspiegeln, or repeated reflections, the idea that the satisfaction of desire must always be fleeting and transient, every satisfaction of one desire the seed for a new desire, Goethe also commits himself to a compositional practice of making the drama itself processive, like the idea of perfectibility. What matters is the process, not the product. Like his hero, Goethe must be forward-looking. Goethe certainly revised, but he revised, as it were, processively, making the newer parts of the play work with the older parts rather than revising the old parts to suit the new themes or plot concerns. In Part 2, Faust seduces another woman, this one the mythic figure of Helena, who arrives on stage believing that she has come from Troy to Sparta, her former home. In every physical sense, however, she is in Germany, a strangely proleptic image of how 30 years after Goethe's death, Bismarck would bring mainly Turkish workers and mercenaries from the land of Troy to Germany to bolster the Prussian economy. Faust seduces Helena by teaching her end rhyme, a feature of poetic language that is alien to her native Greek, but is of course common in German and ubiquitous in Faust. Helen says, "Manifold wonders have I seen and heard, and in amazement have I much to ask. But tell me why the speech of that good man had something strange about it, something strange and friendly. Each sound seems to accommodate the next, and when one word has settled in the ear, another follows to caress the first." "It is the way our people speak," says Faust. "I know that if this pleases you, our music too will charm your hearing, ravish your inmost heart. But it is best we practice it at once, talking by turns, for that calls forth the skill." Helen: "How shall I learn such lovely speech?" Faust: "It is not hard. Say what your heart will teach. And when one's heart's full, one turns to see who'll share the rapture. Share it now with me." Faust: "No past recalled, no future time to guess. Only the present is our happiness." Faust: "It is treasure and gain, possession and a pledge. But what must seal the pledge? My hand," says Helen. As a result of their rhyming, a child, Euphorion, is conceived, whose historical identity Goethe elsewhere associated with Lord Byron, the British poet who lost his life fighting in the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. By this mythic union of Germanic father, Greek mother with its Northern European offspring, Goethe seems to be not only marrying the classical and the vernacular, that is, the Romantic literary traditions, but suggesting the possibility for a united Europe, a vision that vexed much of the 20th century and now newly intrigues the 21st century. Goethe was the exemplar of a specifically German literature in Germany's pre-nationalist period, and for this reason he was later lionized as the unifier of a German sensibility, and also demonized as the progenitor of the German cultural industry that produced the Third Reich 100 years after his death. In this respect, one simple piece of geography remains salient. The Nazi concentration camp at Buchenwald was only 15 minutes from Goethe's beloved Weimar.